Hello aspiring developers, welcome to today's class where we learn about forms. Forms in HTML are a crucial part of web development, allowing users to input data that can be submitted to a server for processing. Forms are commonly used for various purposes such as user authentication, data collection, and more. So without much ado, let us dive and see how forms are created in HTML. If you have been following this course, you know that there is a repository which we forked that contains all the resources you need for this course. So to access today's resources, you can go to the forked repository and update your repo by clicking the sync fork button. Once your repo is updated, you can go back to your VS Code and use the git pull command to pull the changes to your local machine. And once you're there, you can just start today's class. When you pull the changes, you can notice that there is a folder 07 forms that will be created, and the folder contains two files, the index.html file where we write our code, and the readme file which contains the notes that we'll use in this course. So I'll just hit on this button here to open my Markdown previewer, then I'll open my index.html on the left side and my notes on the right side, like that, so that I can write my code here while I'm referring to the notes there. So I'll just start today's class. We have already said that forms are used to collect user input, and the user input is often sent to a server for processing. So to create a form, we use the form element. First, I'll write my boilerplate there by hitting on Shift 1, then hitting on Enter. Then inside the body is where I'll write our code. I'll just rename the title to From Documents to Forms HTML Form. HTML form. So inside the body, I can use the form element like that. So the form element is a container for different type of inputs that a form can contain, and the inputs include the text fields, checkboxes, radio buttons, text areas, and others. We look at all those inputs, but today we'll focus on this input. This will be our focus today. The input element is the most used form element, and the input element can be displayed in many ways depending on the type attribute. You'll notice that the input element is a void element, meaning that it does not have a closing tag, it only has an opening tag, and also it does not have content. We looked at elements and we said that an element like this title element has an opening tag here, has a closing tag here, and has content in between them. But void elements like input only have an opening tag, it does not have a closing tag, and also it does not have a content. And we said elements that do not have a closing tag and content are called void elements. So the input is a void element, and also the input is an inline element. We'll see how the input is an inline element. So let us now focus on this input element, and we can say that the input element has an attribute of type. This type attribute can specify which type of input you can select, and by default the type attribute has the value of text. This is the default behavior of input. So if you just write input and don't provide this type value here, this type attribute, by default the input type will be text, and this input type text creates a text field. So you can save it and see how it looks like in the browser. When you go to the browser, you'll see an empty, you'll just see an input there where you can type text in it, and that is how an input of type text appears. But you notice that this input is not very user friendly, because a user will not know what to type there. That is why you have the label element. So every input will have a label element to guide the user on what they should put in that input. So before we continue about the input element, let us look at the label element. We have said that a label tag defines a label for many form elements. And the label element is useful for screen readers because the screen reader will read out the label when the user focuses on the input. And also the label helps users who have difficulties in clicking very small regions. We'll look at this later, but now let us say that the label is used to help users know what to put in that input. So every input should have a label. So I can say here label, and I can say this is a label for username. So when a user sees username, then beside the username, they'll see the input, the text input. So they'll know that in that text input, you should put your username there. Let us go to the browser and see how this will look like. If you go to the browser, you'll notice that there's this label and the input side by side. So now a user can know what to put in here. So this label improves the user experience. So the user can know here I should put my username. So they just type the username there, like that. And that is how a text input looks like. So we look at the next input is the email input. We have said that the next input type we look at it is the email. So let me just add a comment here and say this was the text input. Then below the text input, I'll put a label, I'll put a comment and say this is the email input. So the email input is similar to the text input, except that the type is email. You can say input type is email. And also you can add the label. You see how the label works. So you can add a label here to improve the user experience. And say email. Then put this like that. And when you go to the browser, I'll just go to the browser and see how the email input looks like. When you go to the browser, you can just see that the email input also is just similar to the text field. But when you try to submit them, you'll see the difference between the text field and the email field. So this is how an email fields look like. The output is just similar to the text field, but the functionality is different. We'll see how this one differs from this one. And also you'll notice that the username and the email, they're on the same line, because it says that input elements by default they are inline elements, so they take only the necessary width that they need. So if you want to take this input below the username here, you can add a line break after the username. So I'll be adding line breaks after every input to make the next input go to the next line. As we said earlier that we'll add some line breaks after every input to make them push the other input to the next line, and that is how you add a line break. So now the email input will be below the username input. Before you go to the browser, let us learn about the submit button. This submit button is used to submit the form. So after you fill your form, you have to submit your form to the server for processing. So to submit the form, you have to have a button, and it is the submit button that submits the form to the server. So to put a submit button, you can use the input type submit, like that, input, then the type will be submit. So this will create a submit button. So I'll just go to the browser and see how this BR and this submit button looks like now. You can now see that the email input is below the username because we added a line break after the username input. So the email input came below it. Also, we added a line break after the email input, so the submit button came below the email input. This is how a submit button looks like. And by default, when you click on submit, the form will submit. You can see the form is reloading up here, meaning it has submitted, so it is reloading. But now let us learn about a new attribute that will help us submit the form easily. There is this attribute called the required attribute, and the required attribute specifies that an input field must be filled out before submitting the form. And that's why I say that this required attribute helps us in form submission, because it helps the user not to submit an empty form. So you can add the required attribute in any input. So you'll add the required attribute in this text input and also in the email input. So to add the required attribute, you just type required. You'll notice that when you learned about attribute, you said that attributes are put in the opening tag of an element, and also attributes are in name value pair like this. Name is type and the value is text. But you also said that there are some attributes that only have the name, don't have the value, and an example of that attribute is the required. Required only has a name, it does not have a value. You just type it, the name, and the attribute is done. You can put the required attribute in the input type text and also in the input type email like that. So now when you save this form, when you try to submit our form without inputting anything in the input fields, the form will refuse to submit. Let us see it in action. And also now we can see the difference between the input type text and the input type email. So without much ado, let's go to the browser and see those differences. When you go to the browser, you'll notice that nothing has changed. The user interface is still the same. But now when you try to submit this form without inputting anything in the input fields, it will complain. You can see it's saying, please fill out this field. So it cannot submit without you filling in the required fields. So I put the name, the username, and the email as required. So I cannot submit this form until I provide a username and an email. So I can just say my username is Janja and my email, let us say, is programmers. When I try to submit the form, first notice that if I not put anything in the email and I submit, it will complain that the email must not be empty. I should fill out this field. And when I fill it with programmers, you can see it still complains. It said that the input should include an @ symbol. And that is how a text input differentiates itself from the email input. Because the text input, you can just write anything. It can be either alphabets or numbers. It's called alphanumeric. You can just put alphanumeric in the text input. But in the email input, you must put something that looks like an email. And by default, an email contains a username, the @ symbol, the domain name, that. This is the format of an email. So if you put anything that is not in this format, the HTML will complain, because we say that the type is email. So you cannot put anything that is not email here. If you submit, it will complain that it should have an @ sign. And also if you put the @ sign, it will say there should be a dot after the @. So you must put something, then dot. You see it's used wrong, so you must put something dot another thing like that. Now if you submit, it will now submit. And that is how a text input differentiates itself from an email input. I think it's clear there. The next input we'll look at is the number input. So this number input is used to input numbers. For example, if you want to take the user's age, you can say age, then you can specify the inputs to be a number, the input type to be number. So this input will only take numerical values, it won't take any text values. Let us see in the browser and see how the number works. So if you go to the browser, you can notice that this number has some 2 arrows here, an up arrow and a down arrow. The up arrow is used to increment the value, The down arrow is used to decrement the value, and you can notice that the submit button is beside it because I didn't put the break line after the input, so I'll go back to the VS Code and put it later. But now I'll talk about the number input. So if I try to type a text here, it won't. I can't type any text here. But if I type a number, let's say 23, it will accept that input. So the number input is important when you want to specify that the input that should be inputted should be a number. And there is this, you can notice that when you go below, you'll find negative values. So if you want your values to be only positive, you can restrict them in the input. And let us learn how to restrict values to a given range. So first I'll add the break line here so that I don't forget. So it's BR, the line break. So to restrict this edge to be only positive number, you can use the min attribute. You can say min and say min is 0. This will set the minimum value to be 0. So it won't go to negative. But let's say that you want for someone to sign up, they should be a teenager. So a teenager is from 13 to 19. You can say the minimum age should be 13. Then there's also this max attribute, and you can say the max attribute should be 19. So this age will only allow you to put a teen age, 13 to 19. So let us go to the browser and see how this works. When you go to the browser and hit this arrow up button, you can see it starts from 13. And when I increment it, it will go till 19, then it will stop there. And also when I decrement it, it will go till 13, then it will stop there. That is how you set a range of age. So the range is between 13 to 19. And that is how you set the range in the number input. The next input type that you look at is the password inputs. So if you want to input a password in your form, you can just create an input of type password. Input of type password. So let us put a label before it so that you can know that someone should input a password there. You can say password like that. So this input of type password will always cover the input that someone writes. It will cover it using stars or using a black circle. So let us go to the browser and see how the input type password works. So you can see here that when I type something in the password, the thing that I'm typing will not be visible. It will be displaying a dot, so that another person cannot see what I'm typing. And that is the default behavior of the input type password. There are many input types. We'll not look at all of them, but I'll just type a few types so that you can look at them. So we'll look at this input type color. You can just paste it there and just write a comment and say color input. And we'll also look at this input type date. You can write a comment and say date input. And also this input type file is how they differ from each other. And also look at the input type time and range. Those are the input types that you look at them. And I'll also add line breaks after each input to make the next input go to the next line. So I'll select this one. I'll select at the end of every input, and then I'll add a line break like that. So let's go to the browser and see how this input type differentiates from each other. Also, you can just add labels. I'll just select here and add some labels so that you can see what label is for each input. And here label, I'll say maybe favorite color. Here I'll say maybe date of birth, because the type is date, I can say date of birth. Maybe file, I can say maybe load CV. The time, I can say arrival time, not sure. Maybe it's bus booking system. You'll have to set the departure time and arrival time. On the range, you can just put here, just range. So let's save these ones and look at how they're visible in the browser. Just save them and go to the browser. When you go to the browser, you can see that the input type color gives you a black input. When you click on that, you can see the color comes up there, and you can select any color that you want. You can use this to drag and select any color that you want, and the color that you select, that will appear here. For example, if I want red, I can just drag this one to red here, then select any intensity of red, and I'll select like that. So this one here is the date input, the next date of birth. This is the date input. So if I click on this icon here, the calendar will come up, and I can just select any date that I want. I can select the year, the month, any date that I select, it will come there. Then this upload CV, this is a file input, and the file input enables you to select a file from your computer. You can see now that no file is chosen, but if I click on choose file, it will go to my file explorer, and I can select my CV there and say open. So the name of that CV will be written here, and that is how a file input works. There's this time input. When you click on it, it will display a time. You can select the time. I can select maybe 7:30 a.m. like that, and we'll write here 7:30 a.m. The range, this is useful if you want to put something that is changing. Let's say if you build a web application for music, you can adjust the volume with this range input. I think that's the most applicable place where you can use this range input. It's like this, and you can change the value by dragging it to any place that you want. This is the minimum, and this is the maximum, so you can put any range in between there, and that is how those input works. As I said earlier, that we'll not look at every input type, but we'll look at this input type radio and input type checkbox later. So now let us focus on this attributes. There's this value attribute that specifies the initial value for an input. For example, if you want by default that the username to have a value of, say, JP, you can set the value of the user input to be JP. And when you save and go to the browser, notice that before even you input a value there in that input text, by default the value will be JP. So let us see how that value attribute works. You can see that when I go to the browser, the username has JP typed in it already, even before I type, because that is the default value that we set in our code using the value attribute. And that is how you use the value attribute. But in most cases, the value attribute is used in the submit. So let us see how the value attribute is used in the input type of submit. You have seen how the value attribute is used in the in the input type text, but it's mostly used in the input type submit. So if you put here input type, I can say value, then I say maybe sign up. Assuming this is a sign up form, you can just say the value is sign up. And when you go to the browser, let's go to the browser and see how this will look like. When you go to the browser, you'll notice that the button there, initially it was written submit, but now it is written sign up. So when you put the value attribute in the submit button, it changes the button text, and that is how the value attribute is used, and that is the common use case of the value attribute, because it's not good to just assume that you can just put the username a value there like that. Another thing we look at today is the disabled attribute. The disabled attribute is similar to the required attribute because it does not have a value, it only requires the name. So if you put this disabled here, by the disabled attribute specifies that an input field should be disabled, and by disabled we mean that the input field will be unused, and since it's unused, you'll not be able to click it or type anything inside it, and that is the default behavior of disabled. And also when you submit the form, the input field will not be sent to the server. So let us save and see how the disabled works. You can see that here the username is not clickable. I cannot click on this input field because I disabled it. You can also see that it is grayed, and I cannot click on it, and I cannot type anything on it because I cannot click on it. And that is the default behavior of the disabled attribute. It makes an input to be grayed, unclickable, and someone cannot type on it. And also when you hit on submit or this sign, when you submit the form, this input field will not be sent to the server. We said the work of forms is to take information from the user and send them to a server where the information can be processed. So if you disable that input, the field name will not be sent to the server. The other attribute that we look at is the placeholder attribute, and the placeholder attribute specifies a short hint that describes the expected value in the input field. In short, the placeholder attribute guides the user on what they should put in that input. So I'll just put the placeholder attribute in the email as the placeholder. Then you can write any text that should guide your user not to put. I can just say enter your email. So let us save it and go to the browser and see how the placeholder attribute works. So if you go to the browser, you'll notice that our email has this enter your email placeholder. So when a user comes to this site, they can be guided by this placeholder enter your email. So the user knows that here I should enter my email, and then enter the email there. And that is how a placeholder attribute works. The other attribute that we look at is the name attribute, and we'll say that all inputs must have a name attribute. Not should, they must have a name attribute for them to be submitted. If the name attribute is omitted, the value of input field will not be sent at all. And the name attribute is something like this. Let me remove this disabled here because I've already looked at it. Let me enable this input. You can say here the name of this input is username, and the name of this other input is email. So every input should have the name attribute, and we're saying that if you don't put the name attribute there, the field will not be sent, because this is how a form works. When you submit a form, the data is sent in name like that. The name of that form will be here and the value will be there. We have already talked about what is the value. of any input. You can set the value using the value attribute, or if you type the value in the input, or you type in an input, that will be the value of that input. So this is how a form will be sent to the server or to the backend. So it expects you to have a name and a value. So if you don't provide a value, it will be sent as an empty value. But if you don't provide a name, nothing will be sent, because this is the key of that. So if it is empty, and the key should not be empty. So if it is empty, it will not be sent. That is why we say that the name attribute is a must for you to have in every input if you want the input to be sent to the server. So I think that is enough explanation. So I'll just add the name attributes to all our inputs, but I'll just add them to the username and the email. But you can also add to the rest of the inputs. But since you're learning about front end, it's not a must to write the name. But notice that if your form does not have a name and you are connecting your front end to the back end, the data that will be collected will not be sent to the backend. So it's important for you to have a name attribute in all the inputs that you have, and that is about the name attribute. So now let us look at the radio buttons and the checkbox, and we'll see how we'll utilize the name attribute in the radio buttons. So I just removed some code there. In our form, I removed the code to create some space. The code is below here. I just commented the code so that you can learn about radio buttons. So below the email input, I can just put there a radio button. A radio button is something like this, has an input type of radio. And as we said, all inputs should have a label. You can say here maybe say select one. And we say that radio buttons displays buttons which you can only select one choice among the available options. So even if there are 3 choices, you should only select only one choice. And let us go to the browser and see how a radio button looks like. This is how a radio button looks like. So here will be the label, and this is the button. You can select it and or deselect it, and that is how a radio button works. As you have said that radio buttons let a user to select one of a limited number of choices. So to use radio buttons effectively, you should have more than one option. So for example, here I can just put a paragraph here and say select your gender. Then in the options I can put one is male. Then I can just duplicate this one here, duplicate it there, and say the other one is female. Like that. So let's see how this looks like in the browser. You can see that in the browser there are 2 options here. The first one is male, the other one is female. I did not put a line break, so this sign up is here. So when you go back to the code, you'll put a line break to make this sign up go to the next line. So you can notice now you can select both male and female at the same time. And that's not the case that you want it to be. You want a user to only select only one option of the available options. And that is how a radio button should look like. So let's go back to the code and modify the code so that a user is able to select only one option of the given options. First, you'll notice that the radio buttons don't have you cannot type. So to set the value of the radio buttons, you can just set it using the value attribute. And this is the other use of the value attribute. Value attribute are used to set the value where someone cannot type the value. So that you can set the value attribute of the first element as male, and the value of the second element here, I can set the value to be female. So that when one selects male, it will be sent, the value will be sent as male, and when one selects the female, the value will be sent as female. As I discussed earlier, that forms are sent like this: name, value, pair. So any input must have a name and a value. So you can notice that our radio buttons didn't have a value because during the when you are selecting, you're not typing anything. So we'll put the value here manually so that when one selects, let's say when one selects male, the value should be male. And that is how you modify, you use the value attribute to set the value of our buttons. And also, as discussed earlier, all elements will have a name attribute. And here is where you'll utilize the name well. You'll notice that we'll put the name value here, the name attribute there, and say it is gender. And also, we'll put a name attribute here. And the value of this name attribute, we'll put it the same as the value of the other attribute. And when the value is the same, this will enable us to select only one of the two. Because as we said earlier that when you send something to the backend, it goes as name, value, pair. And you say that the name is the key and the key should be unique and the key should not be empty. So if you have the same name, the backend cannot send like gender twice. They cannot be like gender, then let's say male, then another gender with the value of female. This one is not possible because we said that the key should be unique, so it cannot have two keys here. So when you select male, the value of gender will be male, and when someone selects female, the value of gender will override the existing value and will replace the male to be female, enabling us to select only one of the two options. And that is how you utilize the name attribute to set the radio buttons to select only one of the two elements. So let us go to the browser and see how the name attribute helped us to select only one of the two options. When you go to your browser, you can see that now we can select either the male or the female. It's not possible to select both the male and the female at the same time, but initially it was possible. But when you put the name attribute to have the same value for both the name and the female, it is not possible to select both of them at the same time. So if you select one and select the other one, the value overrides the one that you had put initially. And I think the radio buttons is well understood. And if you remember when you talked about labels, we said that you can make a label to have a relationship with the input, so that when one cannot click this input, they should be able to click on the label, then select the input. You can see now when I click on this male, I cannot select this input. And also when I click female, I cannot select this input. Let's say it was on male. When I click on female, it will not select this female input. So now let us make it possible to select these inputs by clicking the label. So let's go to the browser and see how that is possible. Let's go to our editor and modify the code so that you can be able to select the input using the label. We learned about ID in the previous class. So in this class, we'll also utilize the ID that we learned previously. So we want to make this label to have a relationship with the input. We saw that in labels, you can see here in label, where was it? I think that's the last thing. You can see in label that label helps users who have difficulty in clicking very small regions, because when the user clicks on the text within the element, it toggles the radio button or the checkbox. In short, it says that when a user clicks on this label, like we saw in the browser, when you click on female, it should change to female, but that was not the case. Now to make it possible, for it to be possible, we'll have to provide an ID, and we said that an ID should be unique in every input. So I can put here ID. In the first input, I can put the ID to be, let's say, male. You can just put any ID that you want, but the ID should be unique. We saw the difference between the ID and the class. And also I can put here the ID of female. And to create a relationship between the label and the ID, we use the for attribute in the label. There's this attribute called for. This for attribute creates a relationship between the label and the input. And the value of this for attribute should be the same as the value of that input that you want it to have a relationship with the label. So here I'll put value is 4. So it will be labeled for male. Then this input, the ID is male. So the value of this ID should be equal to the value of this male, of this 4 here. So if the value of the ID attribute in the input is equal to the value of the 4 attribute in the label, then those two elements have a relationship. So you can also put here the 4 attribute here and say female. And now if you create a relationship between the label and the input, you can use the label to select the input. So let's go to the browser and see how the label can be used to select an input. When you go to the browser, you can now select the value of either male or female by clicking on its label. So when I click on male, you can see now it selects on male. And when I click on female, it selects on female. So to select on male, I can either click on the radio button or the text. Also to select on female, I can click the radio button, or I can also click the text to select. So this helps users who cannot select small regions. Maybe say a user cannot select this button here. So if this button is too small for them, they can click on the label to select that option. And that is how you use the 4 attributes to link a label and the ID attribute in the input to link the two elements, the label and the input. So now let us look at the checkboxes. So below the radio buttons, I'll put a comment and write checkboxes. And checkbox are similar to radio buttons, but they're not the same. So you said that in a radio button you can only select one option, but in a checkbox you can select more than one option, and that is the difference between a radio button and a checkbox. So to create a checkbox, we'll use the input of type checkbox. You can write an input there, then the type will be checkbox. And also you say that the checkbox should have a label. You can say maybe label. So before we write the checkbox, you can write here, use the paragraph in the previous one. You can use a paragraph and say, how did you know about us? Then you can put a checkbox and say ads. Then you can just duplicate this one twice, and you can say here a friend, and the last option will be, let's say, what can we put here? Magazine. So just like the radio buttons, the input should have a value and a name. So the input here, we'll just put all the input should have a value and a name. You can just say name is equals to something, then also value is equals to something. The name has to be unique. So the first name will just say it's ads. The second name will say friend. Then the last name will say magazine. I think that also will be the value. The name will also, the value will be equal to the name. Say ads will be the value here, and also this friend will be the value there, and also this magazine will be the value here. So that is how you create a checkbox. And the checkbox, you said that the checkbox, you can see that the name is not the same in all the inputs, because we want to select more than one option. That's why the name will not be the same. So let us go to the browser and see how a checkbox looks like. When you go to the browser, you can see that a checkbox is represented by a box, and when you select on that box, it is marked. And that is how you put a checkbox. Also, you can use the for attribute to link this, to link the label to the input. You can use the for attribute. So you can go back to our code and write the for attribute. So to make the input to have a relationship to the label, you can add the for attribute in the label and say maybe this is label for ads, and you can say the ID is ads. I'll just remove the name and type the ID. Then this is label for friend, and I'll just replace this name to the ID. Then this will be label for magazine. As we said earlier, when you link an input with the label using the for attribute, the name of the value of the for should be equal to the value of the ID. So if you go to our browser, you can, let's go to the browser and see how that works. So now if you go to the browser, you can click the label to select the input, and that is how a checkbox works. So that was it for today, guys. See you tomorrow in the next class. Peace out.